Welcome to the Operatic Pastcast, a presentation and preservation of operatic memories and impressions, produced by Donald Cullop. Episode 33. The 1956-1957 season was a memorable one for Alfred Hubay, now the Assistant Chief Usher for the Metropolitan Opera. The most momentous occasion was the opening night debut of Maria Meneghini Calls as Norma. In this episode, Alfred Hubay talks about the days leading up to and through the debut, the second performance, and her appearances in Lucia di Lammermoor, with Enzo Sordello and later being replaced by Dolores Wilson. Part 1 of 3.
The 1956-57 season opened with the most anticipated debut that, at least in my 13 seasons, I've ever witnessed, and that was the debut of Maria Meneghini Calls. That's how she billed herself for her debut. The press, everything before her debut, led to wild frenzy of the audience trying to secure tickets for the few performances she sang. Actually, Bing announced it a year in advance. He announced it in early November of 55, which is just about the time that the previous season began, and the furor began right away. And she had come to the Met with an incredible reputation. When Bing announced it, she'd been doing her first season in Chicago, which might have been her only season, I'm not sure. So there was an exodus from New York, from all the people who could get there to hear her performances. She had already trimmed down considerably in Chicago, but the voice, according to my friends who went out to hear the Trovatore, there was still no appreciable decline in her vocal resources. The opening night was October 29th, which was the first time in about 25 or 26 years. The Met opened in October. Actually, in the Gotti years, in the early Depression years, strangely enough, 26 years before, in the early 30s, Gotti opened the season in October, and he had a 24-week season, and this was the first time Bing finally got the season up to 24. During the Johnson regime, the seasons kept on being cut down. When I came, it was either 14 or 15 weeks, and when Bing came, the first season, he inherited, I believe, a 15-week season, so between 1950 and 1956, it finally became 24 weeks. Bing announced that the opening night would be Norma, which had never been done at a Met opening with Maria Meneghini Calls. Norma, of course, was the obvious choice for Callas, but Bing didn't present a new production. This was just a revival of a very old production I had seen in the early 40s with Milanoff, and predated that by some years. Kind of dismal, and in a way, Norma, when you think about it, is not a glamorous opening night. The only glamour was the debut of Callas. In those days, that production was dark, dismal. The chorus of druids doesn't lend any excitement to the visual aspect of it. And so she came to make her debut as Norma in an ancient production with bad lighting. The only compromise I remember at the first rehearsals, they had these graded steps that you don't see from the audience, where she would have to use steps. She was so myopic. I don't think that she wore, I'm not sure if she wore, in those days they weren't perfected contact lenses, but without her glasses she saw very little. And the only thing she asked for, which they did right after the first rehearsal, was they actually made the stage level, kind of raked a little bit, but there were no steps there. I think when you're a singer and you have problems seeing, you have to be looking down if there's steps, so that was the only compromise. But I remember I was so anxious to hear her. I'd only heard recordings of her. I had very few. I had the first record, 78, that came out, the Tristan, that was available in this country. I bought quite a few years before, 1951 or 52. And then I didn't own it actually. I had a tape of the first Gioconda recording she made, which I thought was very exciting. But of course, these recordings were made when she was in her full figured glory, before she lost all that weight. And I was so anxious to hear her that, on a personal note, I finally, after 13 years of my happy life as an usher, moonlighting in the insurance business where they were giving me all sorts of training, and by that time I was a special agent soliciting brokers. I had really graduated to a very good position. They're still hating every minute, but I was approached by the house manager, and he told me that there was a position open, that he wanted me to leave the ushering and go down into the office downstairs and become assistant to the chief usher. And for some reason, I don't know why, I had such a good time. I just thought after 13 years, I guess I saw some of the ushers much older than me that had been ushering for 35, 40 years, and I said to myself, I just don't think it's for me. I can't remember. I was maturing a different way, but I accepted the position on one stipulation. Actually, it was a black tie position for performances, and they would supply the black tie, but anybody who wore black tie, this would be the ticket takers, the chief usher, the house manager, had in gold letters on the lapel, MOA, Metropolitan Opera House. And I said, being reluctant to meet a broker, I'd just taken the lunch coming in, I just asked if I could have the tuxedo made without that, and he said yes. So it made me feel much better, because if I wandered around in black tie, I was always afraid of meeting somebody that was one of my accounts in insurance, as an usher especially, but I figured nobody I knew would go up to the balcony. But the orchestra was a different story, and actually I only met one person who I just thought I was in the audience. Well, anyhow, that's a personal note. So I was privy at that time, even before the season opened, because I came in sometimes to get the lay of the land with the house manager. He had a rehearsal schedule there all the time, because the house manager should have it. And I saw there was a sitzprobe scheduled at 11 o'clock in the morning, and I made certain I would do my schedule around that so I can get to the old opera house to at least sit in on it. And actually, it was with orchestra. I originally thought it was with piano. It was with orchestra. I visualized 3 chairs on the stage with the curtain closed right in front of the curtain, and I got there about 20 to 11. The rehearsal was, the sitzprobe with Clava, who was the conductor, and about 5 minutes later, I had never seen Callas. In walked a striking, tall, very slender, in what they used to call the new look. It was just a simple black dress, but very elegant. And the new look had just been invented in Paris about a year before, where the skirts went down about 6 inches below the knee. So she wore this new look. Later on, I noticed she always wore her dresses the same way, because with all the weight she lost, she didn't lose it in certain. It's very hard to lose it in the legs and the hips. So she walked in. She wore these heavy horn-rimmed glasses, strikingly beautiful in her elegance. And I said to myself, this is a real diva, but she's had such a checkered reputation with her getting involved in the year before with the old manager that had a picture of her in the paper, screaming at her because he wanted to hold her to a contract she signed when she lived in New York, and made a lot of headlines. She came with a lot of press because every time she opened her mouth in a new production, somewhere along the line, the American press picked it up. One reason was that Meneghini, who was her husband, just a new husband, very wealthy, and owned a chain of newspapers. So every critic in Italy would at her performances, and it wasn't planned. She was fortunate to get all this press as a fairly young singer. Matter of fact, she was only, strangely enough, just about 32 when she made her debut at the Met. It was hard to believe. She walked in, she had a score in her hand, sat down. Clava came up those side stairs at the old house to go to the stage, walked over to greet her, and I could hear, because the acoustics in the old house were wonderful. In the new house, sometimes they are not quite. If you spoke on the stage, especially with the curtain closed, you could hear it, especially if the auditorium was empty. And she said, "I'm here to work with you," something like that. I was very touched. She was greeting him, "I'm here for you," with the score in her lap. And they started to talk a little bit, and all of a sudden 15 minutes passed, and Barbieri saunters in. Now this is more than 15 minutes. She came at 11:15. They talked for a while. It was about 11:15 that Barbieri shows up, and about 11:30, Delmonico shows up. They were only going to rehearse. They're not going to do this. This probe was basically for the duets between the ladies and the ensemble with Delmonico, and that's the parts they were going to rehearse. And that's the reason I was wondering why there wasn't a fourth chair for the bass, and that's the reason. And I stayed for a short time, but just to listen to. And they were all marking, all of them. It was early in the morning, and they were basically getting tempi from clave. The Arveso was siepi. And I made a point to be free during the dress rehearsal, which was supposed to be, because Bing didn't want anybody in the auditorium. Well, you couldn't keep Milanoff out. You couldn't keep a few people. So there might have been a couple of hangers-on, maybe 40 or 50 people. And I really wanted to hear it. I don't believe, I may be wrong, but I believe that Barbieri's Adalgisa was the first. Callas had never sung. I don't think Callas had ever sung Norma with Barbieri. I think at that time it was mostly Stignani in Europe. And I can't remember somebody, Elena Nicolai did some with her in Europe too. So it might have been, but even if Barbieri had worked with her, but this was another conductor. And then I made a point of going to the dress rehearsal because I wanted to hear her in performance, actually, although dress rehearsal, you could mark anything you want. She opened her mouth for the Costa Diva, and I was so used to so many voices like Milanoff, well, certainly Delmonico and Barbieri had it, so much squillo and so bright and front. And I heard this veiled sound in the recitative, really veiled and kind of, I can't describe it. I actually thought she was just marking. And as she got into the cabaletta, and as the voice opened up in the upper middle, all of a sudden, it came out a different way. And then the cabaletta was meticulous as far as the musicianship and everything, but the sound, to my ears, I couldn't believe it restricted the sound, because especially when Delmonico was singing, Delmonico had a voice like bronze, and then he had a terrible habit, even though he didn't have to, he would really emphasize his voice by stepping front stage no matter where the action was and just blasting it at the audience. In retrospect, I was wondering why they chose Delmonico and Barbieri for those two roles with her debut. It would have been much better if they found a lower key, let's say. And Barbieri was, she had a very big voice. And even though it wasn't exactly right for Adalgisa, she didn't have the flexibility for it in a way, but it was a big sound. In a way, thinking about that season, of course he made his debut a couple of weeks later, it would have been better if someone like Bergonzi had sung the Pollione. And I can't imagine what mezzo at that time. She was singing a lot with Stignani, who was sort of at the end of her career in Europe, but it emphasized the size of a voice. Besides, it wasn't a big voice because she sang in a veiled and kind of a back of the throat technique. It was hard to believe. Of course, she had lost all that weight. She looked wonderful, but I think that was at age 32, that was something quite troublesome. I sat through the whole rehearsal. Then she started marking, really marking in the duets with Barbieri. And I said to myself, well, what's going to happen opening night? Well, Francis Robinson, who was my predecessor, I became box office manager in '62, and he was my predecessor, and very important. He did all the pricing, and he did everything concerning tickets. And I remember the opening night, Francis Robinson and Bing were walking past my little night office before the performance, and Bing was saying to Francis, $35, that's an outrage. How could people pay that much money? Well, it was the first time in the history of the Met that the prices went up to $35 for opening. Normally it was pretty much the regular price, and the opening of Bing's season in '50, when he packaged the three operas together, you bought the Don Carlo and you bought the Fledermaus and the Dutchman, to get to the opening night, which became public for the first time. The top price for the three operas, including center boxes and prime orchestra, was $60. Well, that's $20. That's $20. So that extra $15 must have riled him. Well, there was no reason for that, because for $60 you got a new Don Carlo, a new general manager, some wonderful new singers, and you got a new production, a Broadway-type production of Fledermaus with a great cast. Here you got an ancient production, badly lit. The only attraction that night was really Callas. I remember the audience. I'm very attuned to audiences. You could feel the tension right after the overture with her entrance, and it was great expectations, and it made the theater feel alive. And she did the recitative, and right beginning the Casa Diva, when you certainly felt the tension going down, down, down. And after the cabaletta, she got what I call a little more than polite applause. It was not an ovation, and she knew it. And what I loved about the Norma, I can't say I love the sound of her voice in any of the performances she sang at the Met. She didn't just stop in the interpretation. The first act cabaletta, then she added on layers to the dramatic part of Norma, not vocally so much, in her interpretation, where the second act, you could see the character unfolding, and she was really a very, very fine actress. But she knew that the audience, no matter what she did with the duets and all, and Barbieri was belting out all sorts of notes, and Callas was impeccable musically. It just didn't project. The audience expected, as I did, expected more, especially the ones who had heard her. Many had heard her in her pre-diet days. It wasn't really a diet. I heard that, I don't know if it was a rumor or not, but through the years, it's never been refuted, basically, is that to lose all that weight, she took a tapeworm, which people didn't do in those days. But she did turn out to be a very, very attractive physically, with a wonderful figure and a great face. Well, she had a great face to begin with, except if you look at the early pictures, there was a lot of fat around it, but the bone lines were wonderful. She wanted to be the greatest singer and the most dramatically beautiful singer. Come to the last act, and she did something I'll never forget, and it was really exciting. In the duet with Delmonico, she must have felt they're going to remember me somehow. She took the chest voice, which was really still in very good shape, and she kept on taking it higher and higher in that duet, and it was so exciting. It was as though she was singing completely on a capital. The audience started to get aroused. Anybody would. I mean, it really was ugly sound, crazy technique, but it was spitting it out. It was so damned exciting that she did get a wonderful ovation at her curtain calls. But I said to myself, what is going to happen to her? I don't know. I don't consider myself knowing a lot about voice, but I do know when I hear something like that it's the kind of singing that anybody would say would ruin your career. It was on a Monday night. The newspapers were not unkind, but not that reviews mean that much, but there was disappointment, except in her artistic and in everything she did artistically, in her musicianship. There was the disappointment in the voice. Saturday matinee was the second Norma. She had 5 days to rest. I was sitting at my desk in my little office. I was, at that time, still assistant to the Chief Usher. I always got there early on a matinee, and Bing runs in, and my house manager was standing right next to my desk, and he said, this was on the come. Unfortunately, the house doctor we had a different house doctor every performance, every night, this was the Saturday matinee house doctor, and he used to come in and hang his coat in that little office. So I knew he was there. So when Bing ran in, he said that, is the house doctor here? Because Madame Callas has to see the doctor. And of course I knew he was, so I said, yes. I said, I know exactly where he is. So he said, but could somebody bring him back? Well, I was the junior member. The house manager wasn't the one to bring him back on the come-in. So I grabbed the bag we had, the doctor's bag, Dr. Esserman, who I got to know very well. First thing he asked me for, because he said he knew that there was a throat problem. Do you have a flashlight? in the bag, and I knew there wasn't one. So as I saw an usher, as we were rounding to go backstage, I just grabbed his usher's flashlight, and we went into a dressing room. And the first thing that surprised me was her speaking voice, which I always assume singers have a very musical speaking voice, and most of them do. Milanoff, Albanese, Tibaldi, it's soft-grained, it's a little bit like their singing voice. It was the most raucous sound I've ever heard. I think there are some master classes where she does speak, and I don't know what accent she was using. She was American-born, but it was an in-between accent. But she complained about her throat, and she said, I feel something's happening there. And she opened her mouth. I haven't seen that many open mouths, but hers was a cavern. And he put this usher's flashlight in there. That's a pretty big flashlight. And he took from the bag, he took a cotton swab and all. And I don't know what he put on it. And he sort of swabbed her throat. And he assured her, that's what she wanted to hear, that there was no visible sign of anything unusual in her throat, that she just might feel that she's getting a little hoarse, and this would actually, he used something that kind of not numbs, but sort of makes it feel better. So she went on and gave the same performance she did on opening night for the first act. The only people in the audience that were there the opening night were those standees that were there was a whole group of standees that were so dedicated, whether they liked her or not. And they were the only ones. Otherwise, it was at regular prices, and it was a subscription, so it was hard to get any tickets for that. She sings the first act exactly the same way, and then prearranged, Bing comes out, makes the announcement that although Madame Callas doesn't want to disappoint you, she's going to go on. She has indisposition, but she doesn't want to disappoint her public. She comes out in the second act, completely transformed. She could hardly walk. She sort of staggers in the second act, and she did something with her makeup. A lot of artists used to do their own makeup in those days, and it looked so pale. And she opens her mouth, and I said to myself, she's sounding exactly the same as she did on opening night. And saying the second act, and then the third act, when she takes the curtain call, she holds onto the curtain for dear life, and she's staggering, and the audience is going crazy. I mean, much more than opening night, because she's giving them a performance even though she's indisposed. And the standees, the big group of crazy standees up in the family circle, some of them had been there the opening night. They knew the whole score. They knew this performance was no different. The only thing she didn't do, and I'm glad she didn't do it, I mean, she was smart enough, is at the very end, she did not do this incredible chest up to the top duet with Delmonico. It was still very good, but you knew that she wasn't going to kill herself doing that. Meanwhile, at the last intermission, we had a fruit and vegetable stand right at the stage door that was a rental. We had the old house, we had tenants outside. We had a shoe shop, and we had this Jake Topple's fruit stand. And it was wonderful because all the artists would come in and buy apples and things. And a group of standees at the intermission went down, and he had fresh carrots with the green tops, and they bought out the whole supply of his carrots. And they bought a red ribbon. Where they find these things, I'll never know. It was on a Saturday afternoon. Well, this is the garment district. And at the very end of the performance, she comes out to take a curtain call by herself. There were curtain calls for Delmonico and for her, and then she takes a solo curtain call, and she's very dramatic at curtain calls, and she's starting to bend down, and from the family circle on the side where the stage was, they almost hit her actually, was this enormous bouquet of really carrots, but from looking at it fast, you didn't know what they were, and when it got on the stage, she saw it coming, and she stepped back on the ground, and all of a sudden they all splattered in front of her. It was Bing was absolutely out of his mind. But as far as singing, all her Normas were, I only heard one more. I heard 3 altogether of the 5 she did. And then the contract called for the Normas, and then they called for, altogether, there were 5 Normas, I think, and there were supposed to be 5 Lucias. It was altogether 12 performances, 5 Normas, 5 Lucias, and 2 Toscas. And she actually sang the two Toscas in between the run of Norma. Like there was, yes, it was November. Her first Tosca was November 15th. And that was right during the run of those 5 Normas. She sang her first Tosca with George London. And there was a tenor who I think basically got his contracts because both these ladies, Tebaldi and Callas, were way above average height. They were not ungainly, but in those days, a woman of 5'9" was a rarity. Today, the gals are running around being 5'7", 5'8", 5'9", but there were no singers that tall. And Callas, and both Callas and Tebaldi even looked taller on the stage. And there was a tenor that was hired, I think, being hired especially, he was a decent tenor, but his own claim to fame was that Callas and Tebaldi loved to have him be the tenor. Forget about Polioni, that Delmonico is short, but that's different. So he did the Tosca with her, which is much more relative for a relationship than Norma is, basically. And it was just named as Giuseppe Compera. And he actually, later on that season, Tebaldi always asked, she wanted a tall tenor, so both Callas and Tebaldi were particularly happy. He was Cavaradossi, and then he was also, later on that season, he was Alfredo. So she sang the two Toscas with Compera and London, again with divided, I say great divided success. There was a camp for her, a camp against her. But what I loved about her appearances, no matter what you thought of Callas, so many people, young people, not just old people, these were basically young people in their 20s and 30s, had heard so much about her, she had so much publicity, that it brought them into the opera. And it was wonderful, even though they didn't have the good seats, the side balconies, the obstructed seats, that all of a sudden you saw young, eager people joining the standees camp, pro and con Callas. It was exciting. I mean, there's no one like that today. No one, right, and can bring in people. Well, the prices are almost outrageous today, but in those days the prices were right, and these were first-time opera lovers, a lot of opera goers who got hooked on opera, because she was visually wonderful to watch. She was not the greatest actress. Actress by instinct, but she compared to others, Delia Regal was also at the same time a wonderful actress with a voice that more letters of complaint to be written to Bing than any other singer. But I happen to like Delia Regal because she was a real natural, in the French manner of plastique. She was like a Bernhardt. She posed a lot, which actresses used to do. They used to, at a certain point on the stage, they would do a posture. As Tosca, she posed against the scenery so beautifully. Callas was like a lion in a way. And those two Toscas were not vocally like Tebaldi, but they were pretty exciting. And then came Lucia. And the first performance was right before the broadcast, actually, because it's pure bel canto. It showed so is Norma pure bel canto. Lucia is a set piece, but you expect the mad scene and all. She did all of the coloratura. What's happening there was, as the voice went higher, it got kind of clearer, but then all of a sudden, at a certain point, I can't describe it. I hate to use the word wobble, but I used to think she always was like waving at me. The voice was waving at me. But it was basically the pressure, because of the loss of weight maybe, at a certain point when she put pressure on the upper middle and the very top, it would have that definite, I call it a wobble. It wasn't a vibrato. It was basically shaking. And it was very apparent in parts of Lucia. The audience was on her side. That was the wonderful part of it. And she had a baritone with her called Enzo Sordello, second-rate baritone that Bing had hired that season to make his debut in Bohème and Marcello. And he was the Enrico with her. And the second performance was the broadcast. At the end of their duet, I don't know, it sounded so strange, it sounded completely unmusical. She ends the duet as written, and he interpolates bellows, optional high note. I guess it was optional if the Lucia was a light coloratura, was singing something like an E flat or something. And he holds on to For Dear Life as the curtain's falling, and she was really pretty pissed off.
Se tradirmi tu potrai, la mia sorte è già compita. Tu m'involi onore e vita, tu le scure presti a me, nei tuoi sogni mi vedrai, ondreato e minaccioso. Quella scura e sanguinosa sarà sempre innanzi a te, sarà sempre innanzi a te, sarà sempre innanzi a te. Tu che vedi il pianto mio, tu che reggi questo amore, se rispetto il mio dolore, come interreggi a te, tu mi doni eterno Dio, questa vita ti ispira. Quella sole sanguinosa starà sempre innanzi a te, sempre, 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 sempre innanzi a te, sempre, 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 sempre
Backstage, Bing was upset because she was upset, and she said something that she couldn't hold on to the note. That's why he did, to cover her. She got pretty pissed off, and Bing decided he actually fired him. And she did the first part of the match scene very well. I mean, musically impeccable, with wonderful, I don't know, it was her interpretation of interpolations, but the little coloratura parts were beautifully done. The second part, it seemed like she ran out of steam each time. She put so much energy in the first part, and the second part of it, she kind of ran out of energy, and the E flat was barely touched, and right before the E flat, that wobble started. So the second part of the match scene was sort of disappointing. This was the second performance on December 8th. And then the next performance, she did something that I think in her whole career, she did very rarely, in the beginning of her career especially. She canceled Lucia. And not a day in advance, she canceled that day. And the cover was a young American soprano whose only claim to fame at that time, and even subsequently, rested on the fact that she was the original baby doe in Central City. Her name was Dolores Wilson. She had sung in The Barber. In The Barber, she was good. She had that kind of personality. She had that kind of voice for The Barber. But the other time she sang one or two other performances, there was nothing special about her voice or her performances. She was very brave. I think she did also in the Hoffman, she did the Olympia. It was strange. She had a good voice. Oscar was more satisfactory in other things. She even did a Gilda. Dolores Wilson was pretty spunky. In those days, not that there were that many tickets available, the subscription was so high, but a Callas ticket was like a piece of gold. And that house was filled with all her admirers. And I was very much on duty that night because we expected a lot of action with irate people, because on the tickets for ever, including today, it says cast subject to change without notice. And that's telling the public, these are opera singers, that if the original cast doesn't show up, they can't ask for refunds. Well, this very tall man came in from backstage, strangely enough, although this happened to be her father. I didn't know him. Nobody knew him. And he started circulating, and I went up to him because he was talking to some people to see what he was saying. And he introduced himself, and he was Callas's estranged father, who was estranged from Callas's mother for years, and who was a pharmacist on Rikers Island. And he was in black tie, actually. As I followed him, he got out into the lobby talking to people to tell them to ask for refunds. He was creating this rumpus. And I told the house manager right away, who came out. And meanwhile, there were lots of people, mainly because of him, at the windows of the box office. And Arthur Wiedhouse, the treasurer, didn't know what to do, so the house manager went back to help him. And meanwhile, I decided, because I was savvy enough even at that time, I knew that we were on Broadway and 40th Street, and there were always policemen around because there was Traffic B, which was assigned to the Broadway scene, and we were just close enough to the Broadway theaters that there was always a traffic policeman to check the flow of traffic. And I just grabbed a hold of him and told him what was happening, and he came in, one of those big, tall Irish policemen, and he simply saw what this man was doing, and he just escorted him. He said, "Now, you're leaving this lobby, leaving this theater." And he got him out of the theater. Meanwhile, I don't know whether the box office broke down and gave any refunds. I don't think so, but it was his soliciting. And it didn't get in a newspaper, but it got into Irving Culloden's book. The funny part of it, in Irving Culloden's book, he said the police had to be called to quell the number of people asking for refunds. Doesn't mention who instigated that. Now, if he hadn't been circulating around telling people they should really get their money back, nobody would have asked for refunds. Dolores Wilson sang a very credible Lucia in her own voice. It was nothing to do with Callas interpretively or anything. She had a good top. It was not fully formed. For some reason, in certain repertoire like Gilda, it wasn't fully formed. I don't, I can't explain that, where it wasn't connected. The top was fine. Sometimes the middle was a bit metallic. It wasn't the voice that you expect for Baby Doll. Of course, Beverly Sills took that over, and it really became Beverly's property. But the Met audiences in those days, and even maybe today, they loved the underdog, which is very American in a way. And after the match scene, she got a big, big ovation. They gave her the ovation of her life. She was so surprised. And I would say 99% of the audience stayed. A few might have left in a huff when they saw the cancellation. There might have been people that, well, they didn't understand that you put an opera on, the singers can become ill. So then they start changing cast. Sordello was fired. They put Francesco Valentino in, and Compra was going to start rehearsals for Traviata, the new production, to placate Tebaldi, who was actually had made her debut two or three seasons before and was a house favorite. Bing had mounted a new production of Traviata to open, I think it was November 21st, with Tyrone Guthrie directing. I mean, really top draw, with Oliver Smith, who was a ballet set designer from the old ballet theater. He was the set designer, and Rolf Gerard, who actually did sets for Bing, was the costume designer. He did great costumes. And Compra, the last performance, Tucker took over. And that's the Callas legacy of the first season. Very controversial. She had violent fans. She could commit no wrong. And then the Tebaldi people were sort of, it was like it happened at La Scala, but it wasn't, it was more vocal than anything else.
Thank you for listening to the Operatic Pastcast. Visit the website at operaticpastcast.com. This is your producer, Donald Cullop.